Hello and welcome to our first day of formal instruction for 2021. Today we are going to be doing two activities. One is a grammar lesson, and then the other is going to be an introduction to Desmond Tutu. So in your teams, and I'm going to kind of walk you through what we're doing today. All right, and your team's under assignments for today. And you'll see that it's, as usual, it's marked out for both odd and your even day. Few announcements. So the first is that last week I sent you guys an email and a remind message about picking up textbooks. We distributed both the volume 2 of your My Perspectives. You no longer need the volume 1, so you can do whatever you'd like with that. Volume 2 of My Perspective. We also had you pick up a choice novel, which was The Lord of the Flies, and then we also had you pick up a grammar packet. If you did not pick up those materials, there will not be an additional time to pick up books. So what I have done is I have assigned, I've given you a couple options. The first is if you'd like to purchase a physical book for yourself for the choice reading, which we will be doing on Wednesdays this semester, then you can purchase your own copy of your book on Amazon for $5.99. If you do not wish to do that, then you can read one of the digital versions of text that I have posted. So if you log into to Clever, and then you go to My Classroom, you'll see our most frequently used links here. You click on your Pearson Savas textbook. Remember that it's your Skyward username followed by your last name in capital letters. And then we're going to go to Realize. So let's take a look here. If you look on assignments, you're going to see that I have assigned for you both the reading that we're going to be starting today, and then you have two book options. Okay, you're going to pick either you're going to purchase the textbook that I gave you a link to, or you're going to read one of these two texts, The Narrative in the Life of Frederick Douglass, or The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. That will be your reading. And then you see here that if you, when you pull it up, it comes up for you. And just like in our textbook, you'll have the text. It takes a second for it to create. So this is normal. So you kind of just let that marinate. Okay. The grammar packet, which I did distribute again, looks like this: Elements of a Complete Sentence. That is linked below. It says grammar packet unit 1 through 3. You will follow my instructions on when we're going to be working with that. And then today, to start our lesson for the day, we're going to begin with grammar. And so there is a Elements of a Complete Sentence. That's our grammar PowerPoint. If you want to go ahead and open that up and follow along with me as I go over it with you here in class, that would be great. All right, so we are talking about elements of a complete sentence. So the first thing that we have is our first element of a complete sentence is an independent clause. This is a clause that contains a subject, a verb, and a complete thought, and it can stand alone as a sentence. So a subject plus verb plus complete thought is an independent clause. An example: Steve excels in the classroom. So I've got a subject, that's Steve. I've got a verb, excels. And then in the classroom, it's a complete thought, okay? So your independent clause can also be part of a larger sentence. For example, because he studies regularly, comma, Steve excels in the classroom. Two independent clauses will be joined together to create what's called a compound sentence. So an example here is Steve is not a great athlete, but he excels in the classroom. So we have the independent clause, Steve is not a great athlete, and then we have the independence clause, but he excels in the classroom. So as a refresh, sorry, I forgot I will not make it big. Okay.
Welcome to Grammar Flip. We give a hoot about grammar.
It's a related group of words that have a subject and a verb. So in order for it to be a clause, there must be a subject and there must be a verb in it. Now let's look at the definition of an independent clause. Well, as we said before, it has to have a subject and a verb in order for it to be a clause, right? But an independent clause is actually going to complete a thought, and then it can also stand on its own. Think about the word independent. It can stand on its own. So basically, it's a sentence. So for example, we might
Visit
say,
grammarflip.com
Okay.
for video lessons, practice exercises,
So
writing
subject,
activities, and
verb,
more.
complete
Start your
thought.
free trial today.
Now a dependent clause. So you think of like an independent, it means I can stand all by myself. I don't need any help from anybody else. A dependent clause needs help. It has a subject and a verb, but it doesn't express a complete thought. And so therefore it cannot stand alone all by itself in a sentence. A dependent clause is part of a sentence because he studies regularly. That's our dependent clause. It needs more. And so one way that I kind of use here to help myself remember this is because he studies regularly, what? If I'm waiting to complete the idea, then I know that there's something missing here, and that's what makes this a dependent clause. An awoobus, you maybe heard of this before. You should have started learning about it probably in like 5th grade, maybe even before then. But it's an acronym to help you to remember the basic subordinating conjunctions. So what an awoobus does is it takes and turns an independent clause, a sentence that stands all by itself, into a dependent clause. And those words are after, although, as, when, whenever, while, unless, until, because, before, and if, and since. So a sentence, an independent clause, I studied for the test. A dependent clause, or what we also call a fragment, if we add that word although I studied for the test. So we have I studied for the test, it stands all by itself. It can just sit right there, I studied for it. Now, if I add that, although I studied for the test, you're going, although what? Like what happened? So you're wanting more. So it turns it into a dependent clause. So I have to kind of add more to that to make it a complete sentence. Although I studied for the test, I still did poorly. All right, here's a grammar song. I'm gonna play a little bit of it for you, just so that you can kind of lock it in your head like a earworm.
After, although, as, when, while, until, because, before, if, since. After, although, as, when, while, until, because, before, if, since. If a sentence begins with any of these words, it's an opener. An opener. If a sentence begins with any of these words, it's an opener. An opener.
All right. Gives you enough to kind of see how that can be catchy, right? So after, although, as, when, while, until, because, before, if, and since. And I noticed I have a typo on the previous slide. It is not sense like senses, like smelling. It is sense like sense. So that's proof that anybody can make mistakes, right? When your English teacher is making an homonym mistake, a word that sounds the same. All right. Phrases. And so if you're following along in your grammar packet, okay, if you're following along in here, then we have covered this first section. And then we've gone down and we talked about dependent clauses, and then we talked about awoobus. And now we're going to talk about phrases. So a phrase is a group of words that does not contain its own subject or verb. So therefore it cannot stand alone as a sentence. And we're going to look at some examples, some participle phrases, some absolute phrases, and appositive phrases. So a participle phrase consists of a verb that ends in en, ed, or ing that functions as an adjective, meaning an adjective describes a noun. So for example, shaken and disturbed, Aaron turned off the television. So shake and disturb are both verbs, and they're both action words. Note that the en and the ed make them so that they are become verbs that describe how Aaron, a noun, okay? So it describes how Aaron is feeling, all right? So if we say shake, Aaron is shaking. That's different, right? Because that's a verb, a sentence and a verb. So it's not functioning as an adjective. Remember, an adjective describes a noun. So shaken and disturbed, Aaron turned off the television. Let's watch a little kind of refresher here on that goes in a little bit more detail.
Welcome to Grammar Flip. We give a hoot about grammar.
Get those by using an ed, an en, or a t on the end of the verb form. But let's look at present participles first. If we said the smiling girl laughed, here you can see we have our verb form to smile. We've added an ing on the end, and it functions as an adjective describing that noun, girl. If we said the skipping boy wore red shoes, again, we see the verb form skip. We've added the ing to the end, making it a present participle. And in essence, we've created an adjective. Skipping describes the boy.
Visit grammarflip.com for video lessons, practice exercises.
All right, so hopefully kind of seeing those applications is helping you to kind of identify the differences here. That was our participle phrase. Now let's talk about absolute phrases. They have a subject, but they don't have an acting verb. These kind of sentences modify the whole sentence, not just a noun. The two types of phrases that are most likely, these two types of phrases are the most likely to be set off by commas. So Aaron stared down at the floor, his hands shaking and his heart racing. So his hands shaking and his heart racing is our absolute phrase. Let's go a little bit more in depth with that.
In this video, I'd like to explain what an absolute phrase is. So an absolute phrase, and this is a very rare kind of phrase. And if you don't remember what it is, that's quite all right. I think most of us seldom use this kind of phrase, but it is sort of an interesting phrase nevertheless. The key to this phrase is that it's really not properly attached to the rest of the syntax of the sentence. In other words, it seems to kind of be by itself. Now, it's not a dangling modifier, so it's not inappropriate in the way it is incorporated in a sentence, but it does seem to be sort of by itself a little bit. And usually it's attached by a comma or a dash. It often comes at the beginning of a sentence, but it can come later as well. And we have included one example here where the absolute phrase comes at the end. But the real core of an absolute phrase is a noun or a pronoun along with some modifiers. So a noun or pronoun with some modifiers. And these modifiers are usually a participle of some kind or an adjective. And you can have multiple of these in an absolute phrase. All right, so the modifiers are usually a participle or an adjective. Let's see how this actually works. In our first example, we read, "The morning dew evaporating, all the soccer fields were drying out." Now you can hear that's a bit of an awkward construction, but it does sort of work. And this first bit is the absolute phrase. We have our noun here, dew, and we have some modifiers. So we're going to call it the morning dew. And we've added a participle, evaporating, which is a present participle. Present participles always end in ing, you might remember. So in this case, we have the morning dew evaporating, and then we start our regular sentence. You can see now that we have all the prerequisites for an absolute phrase, and you can also tell that it's not really being attached to the sentence with, let's say, a preposition. It's not included neatly in the sentence itself. It's just sort of by itself, and yet it kind of works at the same time. If you look at the next one, we start again with an absolute phrase.
All right, so that gives you a little overview, a little bit more in depth about the difference between the absolute phrase and the participle phrase that we've covered. And if you want to get even more in depth with that and continue watching that video, you can do so on the PowerPoint that I've provided for you. Now, the last thing is that we have is an appositive phrase. An appositive phrase restates, redefines, or renames a noun. And a positive phrase should always be placed next to the word or word that it's modifying. So an example here is Mr. Stevens, my psychology teacher. This is the appositive phrase that describes Mr. Stevens, is an interesting man. All right, and then let's take a look at just a refresher. A few
Welcome
more
to Grammar
examples.
We give a hoot about grammar.
Positive phrase just simply renames the noun that's next to it. So if we said a winning prize fighter, Charles put on his gloves, a winning prize fighter is your positive phrase. It renames the noun Charles, which is right next to it. And these appositive phrases can appear anywhere in a sentence. We might say Charles, a winning prize fighter, put on his gloves. Again, we have the appositive phrase, a winning prize fighter. It simply renames who Charles is. We could say the person competing was Charles.
Visit grammarflip.com for video.
All right, so that gives you a little bit more in depth, another example of how you might see those. Now, we mentioned this before, fragments. So a sentence fragment is a group of words that's not a complete sentence. Now, sometimes writers will use fragments meaningfully and purposefully in a piece of literature. However, in most formal compositions, we want to avoid unintended sentence fragments. So types of fragments, they're either missing a subject or a verb. So here, example here, fragment, the guard near the entrance. So there's no verb here. We don't know what the guard was doing. Another fragment, changed into new clothes. Then we have the question, who changed into new clothes? It's missing a subject. A fragment can be caused because an awubis is left all by itself. So because I really like football, and I remember this like dependent clause here, you're wanting more. So because I really like football, what? The correct way to frame this is because I really like football, I'm going to purchase Lions season tickets. Now, phrases that are left all by themselves can cause a fragment. So stranded in the middle of a darkening forest, Laura desperately searched for civilization. So that one cannot stand by itself. It doesn't have a complete thought. We don't know who the noun form is. We don't know who Laura is, right? So the way we can correct this is with just a simple comma. We can join these ideas together. Stranded in the middle of a darkening forest, comma, Laura desperately searched for civilization. Now, here's a couple of other phrase examples. So fragment, hoping that his mother would soon arrive. This is missing something, right? Who's hoping? Okay. So hoping that his mother would soon arrive, comma, Steve fiddled and paced impatiently. And then we have the fragment, Mark slipped away, period, leaving his empty cereal bowl on the table. We need to get rid of that period because it's a fragment right there. Mark slipped away. Wait, that's a complete sentence. Sorry. The leaving his empty cereal bowl on the table is missing, right? So we need to do, that's got that participle phrase right there. So generally we try to avoid beginning a sentence with the words and, which, but, or, such, or as, unless we do that purposefully. So for example, Steve graciously stopped and waited for Leanne, period, which impressed her mother greatly. We can fix that with just a comma. Now we're going to do a little practice here. What a sentence or fragment, so that you can kind of lock in these skills.
Sentence or fragment. Learn the difference. A sentence is a word group that contains a subject and a verb and that expresses a complete thought. A thought is complete when it makes sense by itself. For example, the sick man had forgotten to take his medicine. This is a complete sentence because it has a subject, a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. Another example of a sentence is, for how many years have you been married? Another example, how long have you been a non-drinker? Other example is, what extraordinary strength this bodybuilder has. Another example, hurry! In this example, the subject of the sentence is understood to be you. A sentence begins with a capital letter and ends with a period, a question mark, or an exclamation point. Do not confuse a sentence with a sentence fragment. A sentence fragment is a group of words that does not have a subject, a verb, or both. Here is a sentence fragment. Athletes representing the 30 schools. This is not a sentence. It's a fragment. A sentence would be this. Athletes representing the 30 schools competed at the pen relays. Practices every day for the competition. That's not a sentence. It doesn't convey a complete thought. However, the band practices every day for the competition. That is a sentence. Also, a group of words.
All right, so that gives you some examples, some additional examples. If you want to dive in even further, you can finish watching this video, which is linked on our PowerPoint. So now what I want for you to do is I want for you to pause this video, and I want for you to complete the 14 questions that are on page number 2. I'm going to try to hold this up close enough so you can see those 14 questions. This is in your grammar packet, okay? And what you can do is you have a couple of options for distance learners. You can take a piece of paper and answer these questions on your own piece of paper and then upload a picture for me. You can print out the grammar packet, and then you can record your answers and you can take a picture, or at the end of the 9 weeks, you can turn in that to me. So you have some options there on your Bellwork grammar packet. When we meet again on Wednesday, we'll be doing some more work from this notebook. So it will be great for you to have that in whatever form that you want to do your work before Wednesday. Okay, so go ahead and press pause, and then go ahead and complete your grammar lesson. All right, welcome back from your grammar. We're now going to go ahead and take a look at our background information for our reading that we're going to be completing today. So in your Teams, sorry, I'm clicking on all the wrong things. In Teams, we're going to exit out of our grammar presentation, and we are going to go ahead and open up Introduction to Let South Africa PowerPoint. So I've provided for you a Word document here, and I want for you to go ahead and open that as well. It's right down here. Type your responses here for the Nelson Mandela. So I want you to go ahead and open up that Word document for me. Go ahead and do that now. And in your Word document, I want for you to do a little bit of reflection for me, a little bit of thought work. So either in that Word document, or if you wish to do it on paper and take a picture, I want you to think about the concept of forgiveness. What are some factors that might make it difficult or easy to forgive? Okay. So I want you to take a moment to simmer on both parts of those questions. And then if you have a chance to kind of go talk to someone in your home or household, or even just text somebody that you know, to ask them, what do you think about forgiving people? What might make it easy or difficult to forgive someone? So I want for you to kind of take about 5 minutes and reflect on that. Go ahead and pause your video, and then we'll come back in just a moment. All right, so hopefully you had some thoughts there about forgiveness. That is the essential kind of question of forgiveness versus revenge. Virtue versus vengeance is our theme for this unit that we're working with this 9 weeks. And the first piece of reading that we're going to do is called Let South Africa Show the World How to Forgive. And we're going to start with some background information to kind of help us prepare for our reading today. So apartheid, that's something that we're going to learn about. And you maybe have heard this word before, but if you haven't, it's an Afrikaans word meaning the state of being apart. Okay, so the way that the nation of South Africa lived from 1848 to 1994, so don't you think 1994, not that long ago, really, is that Black South Africans and white South Africans lived separate lives, apartheid, okay? Black South Africans had separate and often substandard educations, living arrangements, and medical care. Now, the best way that we can relate and think about this is the way that separate but equal and segregation operated in the United States from the Civil War until the 1960s. So let's kind of take a look at this background video on apartheid.
On April 27, 1994, Nelson Mandela cast his vote in the first free and democratic elections in South Africa, marking the official end to racial oppression and apartheid rule. Apartheid, a term we've heard before, but what exactly is it? The word itself stems from the South African dialect of Dutch Afrikaans and literally means apartness. But for millions in South Africa, it held a much darker reality. It was a system put in place by the Afrikaner National Party in 1948, which allowed for lawful segregation using racial divides.
Will you intensify your present policy of racial segregation?
The policy of, what do you mean by intensify? Whether any further measures are to come, it's impossible for me to say at the moment. I do not know of any.
The policy governed South Africa for nearly 50 years, but racial segregation existed long before apartheid even began. In 1913, the government passed the Natives Land Act, limiting Black African land ownership to 7% and restricting them from buying or occupying land except as employees of a white master. More than 3 decades later, the practice of systematic racial segregation was given the name apartheid and was extended under the government led by the National Party. The party's goal was to separate South Africa's white minority from its non-white majority, in addition to separating non-whites from each other. They did this by putting in place hundreds of race laws touching every aspect of life, preventing equal opportunities for basic human rights to people of color, including dictating where they could live, work, go to school, all based on their race. Interracial relationships and marriages were illegal, and perhaps most importantly, non-whites did not have a right to vote.
All these laws after 1948 had one purpose in mind, and that was to ensure that the 4 million whites in South Africa had all the resources, the wealth, the jobs, the mines concentrated in their hands.
The Race Classification Act put people in 4 different categories: white at the top, followed by Indian, colored or of mixed descent, and Black at the bottom. And within those groups were subgroups, further segregating ethnic and tribal groups. A number of pseudoscientific tests were used to classify individuals suspected of not being European. For example, the pencil test. This involved putting a pencil in an individual's hair. If the pencil fell to the floor, they passed the test and were considered white. If it stayed put, they were considered colored. Black South Africans were forced to carry identification at all times known as a passbook. Resistance to apartheid laws came in the form of mostly non-violent political protests. Together, freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Ahmed Kathrada started to play an important role for both the African and Indian National Congress parties. In 1952, they began a defiance campaign calling on people to purposely break apartheid laws in order to get arrested. People of color got onto white buses, used white toilets, and entered white areas. Their hope was that the high number of prisoners would cause the system to collapse. But it did not. Thousands ended up in jail. And in 1953, the Public Safety Act and Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed to impose even more severe penalties for demonstrating against the law. On March 21, 1960, a protest against the use of passbooks turned violent in the Black township of Sharpeville, when police opened fire on unarmed protesters, leaving nearly 70 dead and 180 wounded, including children. A state of emergency was declared nationwide, and opposition political parties, including the ANC, were banned, forcing many to move their fight underground.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and nonviolence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
By 1964, most resistant leaders, including Mandela, were sentenced to life imprisonment following the infamous Rivonia trials, which drew international attention. Eventually, a tide of global pressures put the government in a difficult position.
The world was changing. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and that was a major movement. There was increased calls for the divestment of companies from South Africa. There was a global movement to boycott South Africa.
Coupled with unrest within the country and the continued armed struggle, negotiations began between the ANC and the National Party. Slowly, apartheid began to dismantle. In 1990, at the age of 71, Nelson Mandela was released from prison.
I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people.
Elections were held 4 years later, with the ANC winning 62% of the vote and Nelson Mandela becoming president. The people of South Africa won their country back, and apartheid was abolished.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
Thanks for watching Global News.
All right, so that gives you some background into the conditions in which we need to be familiar for our reading for today. So Nelson Mandela, he is the person who completes this speech, which is, I believe, on 663 of your textbook. Nope, nope, wrong. Go ahead and turn my book to it. It's on page 635. Now, Nelson Mandela was our Black nationalist and first Black South African president. He was awarded the 1993 Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in ending apartheid in South Africa. He was an active activist against the past laws that were passed in the country. And these laws required non-white South Africans to carry around a passbook in restricted areas showing that they were authorized to be there. From 64 to 82, he was incarcerated and sentenced to life in prison. So that gives you some background into that first African president. Now, our speech is written by Desmond Tutu. He was born under the apartheid system in South Africa that assigned Blacks to second-class status with limited rights and economic opportunity. He gradually worked his way up through the hierarchy of the Anglican Church to become the Archbishop of Cape Town. From this position, he applied pressure on the South African government to end apartheid. For his efforts, which eventually helped end apartheid in South Africa, he was awarded the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize. In 1995, he was appointed chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which investigated human rights violations during the apartheid era. From 2007 to 2013, Archbishop Tutu was the founding chair of the Elders, a group of independent global leaders working together for peace and human rights. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do an independent read. And while you're reading, we're going to talk about this when we resume this unit on Thursday. But what I want you just to kind of read through or listen to the text. So if you go into your textbook, which just is a reminder on how to get there. We go to Clever, click on the Pearson Savas textbook. And then when you're in here, you'll see that I have this listed as an assignment for you. If you go into where your assignments are, you're going to see let South Africa show the world. And it is going to look like this when you come in here, okay? So I'll let that load for a second. Or you can read the book, which is on page 635, if you have the physical textbook. And I just want you to read the speech and think about anything that pops to your mind. Read or listen to the speech. The speech is 10 minutes and 43 seconds long. So I want you to read it independently. When we come back to class, we are going to talk about and do a close reading to investigate and then answer some questions on it. Thank you for joining me on my video today, and I hope that you all have a great day.